Welcome to our program, John Lough.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
US President Donald Trump says that Russia had made a mistake regarding his statement, and that's how he responded to Russia's attack on the Ukrainian city of Sumy. From your perspective, why does US President Trump justifies Russia's war crimes and attacks on civilians?
Well, I'm not sure that he's deliberately justifying war crimes. His motivation is to keep his negotiations with President Putin running. And for that purpose, he does not want to criticize the Russian side. We've seen, at least on one occasion, that he may be becoming a little bit frustrated with Putin slow walking these talks and showing that he's really not interested in the approach that the Americans are offering, namely a ceasefire first and then a broader discussion of what a peace settlement might look like. What Putin clearly wants to do is to really front load this process and go straight for a straight peace settlement. And that's what's really seems to be the problem in these talks at the moment. So for the moment, the Russians are keeping up largely a pretense of talking, it seems to me, at least not negotiating in good faith, and fighting at the same time in the hope, it would appear, of trying to improve their position when they finally get to the negotiating table for real.
Do you expect Russia to accept any kind of a full ceasefire for real this year?
I don't expect Russia to accept a ceasefire without conditions, and Ukraine has indicated its readiness to, go for these 30-day ceasefire arrangements as proposed by the Americans. But on both occasions, with regard first of all to the ceasefire concerning strikes on energy infrastructure, the Russians set conditions, and they set even more conditions for the ceasefire in the Black Sea. So it's going to take, if the Americans want to make progress in these talks, they're going to have to put the Russian side under pressure. But the real question here is whether President Trump is actually prepared to do that, because his behavior so far suggests that he isn't. And I think this is where the Russians see the opportunity just to carry on fighting in the belief that they can eventually force Ukraine to capitulate.
From your perspective, do you feel that Russia would like to settle this war on appropriate terms in the nearest future if, for example, Russian forces continue to fail to achieve all strategic aims which were also ordered by Vladimir Putin?
I think, Daniel, your question presupposes that the current situation will continue, and you may be right that Russia's in obviously an attritional war here. It is advancing, but very, very slowly and at huge cost. And meanwhile, in some places, the Ukrainian army is actually fighting back quite successfully. So it is a mixed picture on the battlefield, but the general impression is that Russia probably overall has the upper hand. Now, the question that I think the Russians need to answer for themselves is, what are the chances that if the current US aid package, well, when it runs out, effectively the supplies that were delivered or are still being delivered as a result of the US package that passed under the Biden administration, the last military aid package, when those supplies are exhausted, to what extent can Europe fill the gap? Or indeed, can Ukraine, in fact, buy weaponry to fill the gap? Because at that point, I think it will become clear how long Ukraine can continue to fight. And I have the impression that the way Moscow reads this is that Ukraine is going to lose the will to fight because it's going to have much less weaponry. And if Russia can continue to try to degrade the Ukrainian army and at the same time demoralize the civilian population, then the chances of Ukraine maintaining this level of resilience, those chances are reduced. So I think that's the picture that we're looking at the moment.
From your perspective, are there any chances that Trump's administration will consider and green light also selling weapons to Ukraine, as President Zelensky recently proposed Donald Trump to sell Ukraine Patriot anti-aircraft systems? President Zelensky says that he has money for such purchase. Also, he suggests that Europe could be involved in such a new mechanism.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I remember recently that Trump implied that the US would help Ukraine to find air defense weapons, particularly these Patriot missiles. Now, sourcing those in Europe is a challenge because European countries don't, as I understand it, don't have many of them either. But I do tend to think that if Putin continues to dig his heels in, that these talks don't advance rapidly, then Trump is likely to become frustrated. And there is a chance that he will then want to put, a degree of pressure on the Russian side. At the end of the day, he doesn't want to look weak here. He was the one who said in his election campaign, I can end this thing in a day. And we'll soon get to 100 days of Trump's second presidency without any sort of tangible result. Now, his negotiator, Steve Witkoff, has now met Putin, I believe, 3 times. He had a 4.5-hour conversation with him in Moscow late last week. And the statements he's made so far to describe those talks and what was achieved, if anything, those statements are pretty sparse. I mean, he's not giving away much, and one has the impression that, in fact, the talks really haven't advanced a great deal. Because if they had, we would certainly have heard something from at least one of, if not both sides. But really, the reaction has been pretty muted so far.
Also, Wall Street Journal reported about a split in Trump's administration between Marco Rubio, General Kellogg, and Steve Witkoff. According to the Wall Street Journal, both Rubio and Kellogg are proposing Trump to put more pressure on Russia. On the other hand, Steve Witkoff is proposing a quick ceasefire deal, and he's confident that such a deal could be reached in the nearest future. What is your assessment of the current internal debates in the White House on the next future strategy on ceasefire talks and Ukraine?
Well, Daniel, we can only really judge by the public statements and what we know of the backgrounds of the people involved. And I think the Wall Street Journal report is probably correct that there are definitely differences within the administration. And we know from General Kellogg's writings, we know from Marco Rubio's statements, as a senator, his view of Russia, indeed of this war. And I don't think either of those two wants to give ground to Putin and if you like, appease Russia. At the same time, you have Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate developer by background. He has no diplomatic experience. He has no real knowledge of Russia. He appears to have only a superficial knowledge of the issues at stake in this war. He's unable to name the 4 regions of Russia that Russia lays claim to, in addition to Crimea. And he's somebody who thinks as a businessman, and that somehow there's a quick deal to be done here. And I suspect that Putin's done everything to sort of create that impression with him that Russia is actually close to agreeing to something, in the knowledge that he will take that straight back to President Trump, and Trump will believe that progress is being made. But it takes diplomats with, I think, deep experience of Russia to understand really how Russia negotiates, how to read the language that Putin is using, And I wonder who else has been in the room with Steve Witkoff to, help him perhaps interpret what's being said. And, ideally, you should have somebody there who's also a very competent Russian speaker and who can listen to the Russian and actually tell you how well it's being translated. Because it will be, Putin's translator who's putting it into English for Witkoff. So already there's a challenge. But I simply don't know what it looks like there in the room. But it sounds to me as though Witkoff has been there pretty much on his own, presumably with his own interpreter, but no advisor with him beyond that. At least we haven't seen that person if they are present. And that seems to me gives Putin an enormous advantage, given just his level of knowledge of the issues, the details, his experience of dealing, for over 25 years with foreign governments at the most senior levels. He plays this game very competently as a negotiator. So that makes it very hard, I think, for the American side.
Is there a chance that Russia is manipulating Steve Witkoff and his negotiating team during this round of negotiations? And second question, don't you think that Witkoff has become a friend of Russian dictator Putin, because it seems like he is really happy to meet Vladimir Putin? According to latest video, he also has placed his hand on his heart while meeting with Putin. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, the Russians will wish to exploit his lack of experience, his naivety, and his readiness to, on behalf of President Trump, to whom he reports, to try to achieve some quick deal. And so we have this situation where the Americans are in a hurry and Putin is not. And Trump's advice in his book, The Art of the Deal, is never to put yourself under time pressure in a commercial negotiation or any negotiation. But that seems to be exactly what the Americans are doing here. I mean, judging by the interview that Witkoff gave to Tucker Carlson, you have the impression that this is somebody who has been impressed by his interaction with Putin. He's had that sensation of dealing with the person on the Russian side who is responsible for taking Russia into this war. He is the ultimate decision maker, and that meeting with the top decision maker that always tends to impress people. And no doubt Putin has used his charm, which he's able to deploy. The story about Putin praying for Trump after the assassination attempt, it really brings back memories of his first encounter with George W. Bush, when he told Bush this story about the crucifix, and Bush felt that he'd learned something about Putin that gave him deep insight into his character. So it sort of rather feels as though Witkoff has been subjected to similar treatment, and in his case, it's clearly had some effect. So I don't know. I've also I watched the video and seen the photographs of this sort of gesture he made, where he put his hand up to his heart. It's kind of difficult to know how to read that beyond the fact that he's obviously deeply respectful towards Putin, and that I think also came across in the Tucker Carlson interview. I mean, not a word of criticism for Russia or Putin's behavior or his responsibility for this appalling war. Just it seemed as though he'd really consumed the Russian narrative, and kind of imbibed it, and was willing to repeat it. And to see and hear President Trump talking again about President Zelensky being responsible for this war and the start of this war, it really does beg a belief. How is it that a U.S. president would take this line? Seems to be reading straight from Putin's script.
On the other hand, we have General Kellogg, who is proposing a plan to divide Ukraine with zone of controls, according to his latest interview with Times, like Berlin after the World War II. What is your take on such a plan to impose zones of control inside Ukraine using also European forces? And is there a chance that Trump could support this initiative?
Well, I personally found that the reporting of Kellogg's remarks in the Times a little confusing, and I think he then walked back one or two of the things the Times had claimed. But the implication was, and he's not the only person to say this on the American side, is that Ukraine is going to have to accept that Russia currently occupies territory that Ukraine cannot immediately recover. And effectively, the Russians are going to stay there. But at the same time, there is a need to ensure that Ukraine can defend the rest of its territory, has adequate means to do so, and can rely on its European allies in this case to help it in that task. So I think that's really what General Kellogg was alluding to. I'm not sure that he really sees that European forces, for example, are going to be part of, let's say, a defense force in Ukraine. I personally don't see that happening. They might be there to provide training, some level of reassurance through their presence. They may act as a kind of, tripwire, just as we have in the Baltic states at the moment. We have this forward presence that NATO has built, where we've got various countries, including Germany. And trying to think who else. There are other countries there with forces of forward deployed, and the purpose then is to reassure the host countries through their presence, and also, if there were to be some form of serious Russian aggression, then Russia would be attacking the forces of those countries. So that might be an outcome that we see in Ukraine, that a relatively small presence, perhaps in the west of the country, of a number of European countries, and I think 10 to 13 countries have already offered to deploy forces, but to believe that these would be peacekeepers who could be engaged in a peacemaking operation, I think is just way too optimistic. European countries don't have the appetite for that. But there are plenty of other things that they can do, I think, usefully, to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself much more effectively. And my sense is that ultimately the guarantee of Ukraine's security, in fact, is going to come from Ukraine itself. But Ukraine's allies have to put it in a position where it can create that capacity.
And do you feel that people around Vladimir Putin, his elites, and also population are in favor of full ceasefire in Ukraine?
We don't see, we can't measure, of course, Russian public opinion at the moment. But if you watch Russian state media, then, and I try to keep an eye on that every day, then the message you as a Russian citizen, I think, would go away with is that Russia is advancing very successfully, and it's only a matter of time until the Russian army defeats the Ukrainian army. That this is just a process that is underway and is not going to take very long to complete. As far as the entourage of President Putin is concerned, again, very hard to say, because we don't talk to these people directly. We can only try to interpret some of their statements, but the general view is that there are people within the entourage, some of whom are more enthusiastic about the war than others. And it's said, for example, that Nikolai Patrushev was one of those, former head of Security Council, was one of those who was more skeptical about the war. I believe also that the head of foreign intelligence, Narishkin. But where those people stand now is harder to say. But from a Russian perspective, if you think that you're winning, and of course that's an open question here, if you think that Ukraine is suffering from extreme fatigue, is going to be abandoned by the United States, and that the Europeans simply don't have the capacity to support Ukraine properly, then you could reasonably conclude that this war is winnable. So why would you stop at this point when you actually don't need a ceasefire, but you see victory just being around the corner? Now, I personally think that that is over-optimistic on the part of Russians who think that way, that this war is most likely to carry on for a good long while, and the challenges for Russia are going to increase. And most particularly if we now see a period, we may have entered a period where the oil price is going to be depressed for a good period. Because if we enter a global recession as a consequence of President Trump's trade policies and tariffs, then that lower oil price is going to have a potentially quite a severe effect on Russia's finances. But my understanding is that, even if oil were to hit $40 a barrel, the Russian economy could carry on for a while. It has a degree of resilience. But where it would be 9 months or a year later is another matter, particularly with this level of defense spending. So the picture for Russia, I think, is not quite as rosy as state media would paint it. And there may be good reason why Putin, in fact, should try to seek a ceasefire right now. But he clearly doesn't see it that way, or he would be behaving differently.
Thank you, John, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel.